Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for tuning in today and to the Toronto Public Library for having us. I'm very excited to dive into some more stories from baseball's past. And this month, we're going to talk about some of the strangest stories that you'll find in the history of baseball in our city. And when you're talking about strange and baseball and Toronto, I think one of the best places to start is here. This is Toronto as it looked in 1936. So these are the days of the Great Depression when the city is suffering in so many ways and people are really looking for distractions. It's an era of movie theaters and the strange Great Stork Derby and all sorts of Depression era entertainment. One of the weirdest of which was happening on one evening in 1936 out on St. Clair West. This is Oakwood Stadium. It used to stand at Oakwood and St. Clair. The only photo I've been able to find of it is from years later when it had been transformed into a racetrack for cars, as you can see here. But on this evening in 1936, it wasn't home to races. It was instead home to a charity baseball game. It had been organized by the York Lions Club to raise money to buy eyeglasses for underprivileged children who couldn't afford them themselves. And this game managed to attract a bunch of sort of well-known local players, politicians, mostly minor celebrities, business leaders who took the field to raise money for these kids. The starting pitcher that night for one of the teams was none other than the acting mayor of Toronto himself, William Robbins. He would soon become just the plain old mayor when the current mayor, Sam McBride's illness turned out to be fatal, and Robbins would be mayor for years, I believe, after that. And the guy he was pitching to start off this game was another big local civic leader, this one, Marsh Magwood. There's Magwood Park and Forest on the banks of the Humber and Bobby Point that are named after him. He was the Reeve, so sort of the mayor of York Township. Now, some people suggested that a mayor outranks a Reeve, and that Magwood, maybe in deference to the mayor of Toronto, should have sort of purposefully maybe swung and missed at a few of Robbins's curveballs. But Magwood would do no such thing. Instead, Magwood connected with a pitch and launched it for a home run, kicking off the ceremonies in pretty dramatic fashion. But it was after that that things got strange, with these leading politicians now leaving the field and making way for the rest of the players. Things would really change. The next hitter to come to the plate was another, I think, local business leader who, again, connected with a pitch and blasted it deep into the outfield, hitting it hard enough that it looked like it would be a triple. But things wouldn't be quite that easy, because this is the point where things got complicated. This was no ordinary baseball game. And the very next thing that hitter had to do after blasting that ball deep into the outfield was to climb aboard a donkey and then try to convince it somehow to go to first base. This was perhaps the most notorious game of donkey baseball in Toronto history. And that story of local politicians and business leaders playing a game of baseball on donkey back, that is far from the only bizarre story in Toronto's baseball history. So that gives us our theme for today's talk: Toronto's baseball tales, the bizarre and the unlikely. And we'll come back to Oakwood Stadium and to these donkeys in a little bit. But by the time 1936 rolled around, there was already a long history of strange baseball in our city. If you tuned in last month, we talked about baseball in Toronto in the 1800s, and there were lots of strange stories as part of that as well. We talked about Cannonball Crane, the first real star of the Toronto Baseball Club, who would go on to become an infamous alcoholic, traveled the world getting into trouble with his pet monkey. We talked about first baseman Jay Fatts, who had such an anger problem that the Globe suggested he should be muzzled every time he took the field, and Crane's battery mate, Harry Decker, who would become the most notorious con artist on the continent, called by one detective the most dangerous man in America. And we talked too about their Ball Stadium, the first ballpark purposely built in Toronto. If you want to see their stories and you didn't turn in last month, I know the library's already posted it to their YouTube page. So you can tune in there and see the story of how this strange team managed to win the city's first baseball championship there at what became known as Sunlight Park, built at the corner of Queen and Broadview, across from where the Broadview Hotel is, right on the banks of the Don River. But the Toronto Baseball Club, as it was called, very creatively, would only play a few seasons at Sunlight Park. The team eventually kind of folded. They stopped playing any games, never mind any, at Sunlight Park. And when sort of a new version of the club was reconstituted a few seasons later to play essentially in the same league, the International League, briefly called the Eastern League, one of the big minor leagues still around today, the AAA league that the Buffalo Bisons, the Jays AAA affiliate, plays in. Well, when this new version of that old club was founded, they would get another new home. They would leave the East End behind and move to a rather unlikely location across Toronto Harbor from downtown, the downtown core. This ball club would move out to Hanlon's Point. It was largely, it seems, the doing of one guy in particular who was eager to get people to head out to the island. This is Lowell Solman. Lawrence for long, Lowell for short, LOL, just like laugh out loud. I think he's pretty lucky to have been born about a century, more than a century, before people started using that acronym. And he had all sorts of business interests out on the island already. He kind of got in his start in Toronto as the manager for the restaurant at the Hanlon Hotel out at Hanlon's Point. He was business partners with Ned Hanlon, the famous rower whose family had been living out there for many years. He actually married Ned's sister. And working with Ned Hanlon kind of helped expand their recreational empire out on the island. The hotel got bigger, and they built other attractions as well. Now, Lowell Solman, he would become one of the leading entrepreneurs in Toronto. He ended up being the owner of the Royal Alex Theatre, vice president of the Lowe's cinema chain. He was the creator of the Sunnyside amusement park on the shores of Humber Bay, one of the owners of the Arena Gardens where the Leafs used to play, and the founder of the Toronto Ferry Company. With all of these interests out on the island, Solman decided to found the business that became sort of the monopoly of traveling to the island back in the early 1900s. It was a private company back then run by Solman, who had the exclusive contract with the city to provide the ferry service. Lots of the ferries that we have in service today, I imagine all of them, are old Toronto Ferry Company boats, like the Trillium, the oldest of them all, that were first in service during this era before the city took over the ferries. And so Lowell Solman, as the founder of the Toronto Ferry Company, He was always looking for ways to get people to visit the island. There was the hotel, a boating club. They built a whole amusement park out there at Hanlon's Point with all sorts of rides and attractions, trying to get more people to take the ferry. Some of the attractions were even deeply bizarre. Probably the most infamous is the diving horses named King and Queen, who would be launched off this platform, leading to some of the strangest photos in Toronto history, splashing down into the water just off Hanlon's Point. I'm afraid horses weren't treated any better than donkeys were in days gone by. And Lowell Solman's plan was to take advantage of the fact that there was an old lacrosse grounds out there that he had sort of rebuilt and expanded into the new ball stadium for the new version of the Toronto Baseball Club. And so that's how Hanlon's Point Stadium was born and how that baseball club got their unlikely new home. Now, they would have a new name as well. They were called the Toronto Maple Leafs, with those colors of blue and white, all about 30 years before the hockey team stole the baseball team's name. They would be the big professional team in Toronto for the next 70 years. Before the Blue Jays, it was the Leafs, all the way up until the 1960s. And it's said to have been one of the greatest minor league franchises of all time. 15 Cooperstown Hall of Famers and many Canadian Baseball Hall of Fame members played for those Maple Leaf clubs. They'd end up winning 10 championships, many of them out there on the island, and 5 of their squads are listed on the Major League Baseball list of the greatest minor league teams of all time. There was lots of glory to be found out there on the island, and lots of money too. This all meant that Lowell Solman could charge you twice every time you went to a baseball game. You'd buy a ticket to the game, but you'd also buy a ticket on one of his ferries. And maybe while you're out there, you might visit the amusement park or the hotel, go for dinner. Lowell Solman making money off you all the time. In fact, if you wanted to try to save a little money, you could commit a little more upfront and get a pass like this one. There would be a season's pass for the ferry. You can still find these around. This one was shown to me by the wonderful Toronto baseball historian, Canadian baseball historian, Bill Humber, who owns this one, which is remarkable because it's not just a piece of ferry history, but baseball history too. You could get a season's pass for the ferry, and on the other side of the coin would be your season's tickets for the Toronto Maple Leafs playing at Hanlon's Point Stadium as well, so that Lowell Solman was making money off you every which way. And this is what this new stadium looked like. Now, this is one of my very favorite photos, I think really in all of Toronto history, certainly in Toronto's baseball history. It's from the first season that the Leafs played out at Hanlon's Point, and is filled with all sorts of little details I find fascinating. Someday I'm going to write a whole newsletter post that's nothing but the story of this photo. There are more details than I can even get into today. We don't have time for it, but I wanted to point out a few to you to show you how sort of familiar and yet strange baseball in 1897 would seem to our modern eyes. For one thing, if you look off to the left of this photo from 1897, you'll notice that the pitcher is throwing off flat ground. It's the pitcher's box back then. There's no mound yet. And that guy standing behind him, craning to see, that's the umpire. He used to stand behind the pitcher instead of behind the catcher. Though I suspect even from out there, he'd be able to see some of the pitches more successfully than some of the modern umpires, who do a wonderful job, but ABS is really highlighting some of those bad calls. And that's just one corner of the photo. If you turn your attention to deep right field, you'll see the scoreboard out there. It lists the other teams in the league and also gives us a clue as to which exact game this is, because Toronto is playing a team just labeled as C. It turns out this is an exhibition game. They were playing against the Major League Cleveland Spiders of the time. You'll notice, too, that Toronto's listed first with Cleveland underneath them. It's because the home team used to actually hit first. There were no walk-offs back in the late 1800s. And this right field corner is filled with other details too. You can see people have climbed up onto the fence over here to try to get a nice view of the ball diamond. One of my favorite details is that beneath the scoreboard, if you look really closely, you'll notice someone's just left a ladder, probably the ladder you use to change the score on the scoreboard, just right there at the base of the outfield wall, very much in play, this ladder lying there on where the warning track should be. And the right fielder is also fascinating. He's a Cleveland Spider by the name of Crab Burkett, which has now become, since I learned this, one of my favorite baseball puns. He's actually in the Hall of Fame in Cooperstown. He still holds the record for the greatest number of inside the park home runs in his career. I believe 55 of them. He's also fourth on the all-time list for errors by an outfielder. So not exactly a slick fielder, but also said to be one of the greatest bunters of all time, which I'm sure would make the Milwaukee Brewers, the Jays just finished losing to, pretty happy. And, of course, one of the all-time great nicknames, too, of Crab. And so even just this one photo is filled with these strange details at a time when the city's baseball team was led by a particularly strange man. This is Foxy Irwin. I think you can tell just by looking at him. He's got a very foxy look to him, so the nickname makes sense. He was himself actually a Torontonian, one of the first great Canadian baseball stars who moved to Boston when he was young and went on to his major league career from there, but returned to our city at the end of the 1800s with that first season at Hanlon's Point to become the team's shortstop and its manager, and actually ended up being a co-owner as well. And given how things worked back then, he was also basically the team's general manager. So along with Lowell Solman, one of the real forces behind the squad. He is said to be one of the players credited with inventing the idea of a baseball glove, having worn some padding after he broke a couple of fingers. Some also credit him with inventing the squeeze play, bunting to get a runner in across home plate. And in Toronto, he'd have a huge impact on these years of our baseball culture. He loaded that team out on the island with talent, wheeling and dealing to bring some of the biggest stars in the world to Toronto. Our first baseman at the time was Dan Brothers, who would go on to become a Hall of Famer, one of the great sluggers of the time. He and Irwin played together as they tried to found their own player-owned league for a little while in competition with the other major leagues, giving profit sharing to the players in the days when the owners tried to keep an iron grip on players and their salaries and their rights to play for particular teams with what was known as the reserve clause. Irwin and Brothers were big sort of baseball labor leaders trying to win rights for players long before free agency was finally won. And Brothers, even though he was one of the greatest sluggers of the Victorian age, wasn't even the greatest slugger on those Toronto teams out at Hanlon's Point, because Foxy Irwin also managed to get us Buck Freeman. He played right field. Given the shape of the diamond, because it was sort of smushed into the long shape of Hanlon's Point, right field, the fence, as you can see in this photo, is not far away at all. Buck Freeman was famous for getting ground balls to right field and then throwing players out at first base, little like Jose Batista did once or twice back in the day. But the thing he was most famous for were his home runs. He was a left-handed hitter, just like Brothers, so that short porch and right would have been very inviting for him, blasting home runs after that over that short right field wall. And he helped lead Toronto in that first season on the island to their first championship under the Toronto Maple Leafs name. But 1898, the following season, their second season on the island, is when some of the strangeness began to play out. That year, as the Leafs season was progressing, Foxy Irwin started trading away many of the team's greatest stars, including Buck Freeman himself. The greatest slugger of his age now found himself playing in Washington, D.C. instead. In fact, he wasn't the only Maple Leaf who suddenly found himself playing in Washington. Player after player was traded to what I believe were the Senators back then. 5 of Toronto's best players suddenly found themselves in Washington. Maybe a bit of a mystery until the following season rolled around, and who turned up as the new manager of the Washington team? None other than Foxy Irwin, who was then accused of having sold all his best players to Washington so that then he could go manage them in his new home, leaving Toronto a little bereft in the process. Buck Freeman that season, 1899, would have one of the greatest slugging seasons of the age. He ended up hitting, brace yourselves for this, a whole 25 home runs, an unbelievable number for that dead ball era. In fact, only one hitter had ever hit a greater number than that, and that player was playing in a ballpark that had an even shorter right field. The right field fence was only like 300 feet away, so people didn't even really count that as the real home run record. And so Buck Freeman's 25 was held up as the golden standard until Babe Ruth came along years later. He also led the Red Sox to their first world championship. I'll leave it to you to decide whether you can forgive him for that or not. He went on to this illustrious major league career, and Foxy Irwin enjoyed the success of that 1899 Washington team. But in the end, Foxy Irwin's story would come to a strange and tragic and very watery end. It was decades later, in 1921, that Foxy Irwin started having stomach pains and other symptoms that proved to be a fatal case of stomach cancer. He knew he didn't have long to live. The doctor said he only had days. And distraught, he decided to make one last journey. He took a ship, in fact, this exact ship, from New York City to Boston, telling his fellow passengers that he was going back to his hometown to die. But when that ship eventually pulled into Boston Harbor, Foxy Irwin was nowhere to be found. The old Toronto shortstop had disappeared from the boat. There were all sorts of theories about what had happened to him. Some people said he had been murdered on board the ship. There were rumors that he was carrying a large amount of cash with him. We think, in truth, he had probably thrown himself overboard. All his stuff was left untouched in his cabin, and knowing he was going to die very soon, seems that Foxy Irwin likely took matters into his own hands. It wasn't long after, however, that a new theory emerged because Foxy Irwin's greatest secret was uncovered. Foxy Irwin had 2 wives and 2 separate families, secrets from each other. He had first married a woman in Boston, had kids with her, and then left her behind during his major league career, and ended up marrying a second woman who lived in New York City and had children with her as well. It wasn't until he was dying that the secret came out. One of his sons was the first to figure it out when he went to go visit his dad in the hospital, and he heard stories about another son, a son he didn't know existed. And since a family was in Boston, historians now think that Foxy Irwin was likely thinking he was going to go visit his first wife. He ended up leaving her quite a lot of money in his will, which was a big surprise to her. He had had no contact with his first family. Apparently, for years, all a big shock to both of his families and to the press as well. So that Foxy Irwin, our first star shortstop out on the island, proved to be bigamist and quite a secretive man with a deeply strange twist at the end of his life. Meanwhile, out there on the island, the team continued playing without him. And they actually moved away from the island for a few years too, under new ownership. They were taken to Diamond Park, which is in the place where Liberty Village is today. Played a few seasons there, won themselves the pennant in 1902. And it was incredibly good timing for the Leafs to be playing on the mainland, because out on the island, disaster struck. You can get a sense from looking at it that the old Hanlan's Point Stadium wasn't exactly fireproof. And so in, I believe, 1903, the stadium burned down. You can read old newspaper reports of Lowell Solman running around trying to help the volunteer firefighters put out the blaze, hooking hoses up to hydrants that turn out not to have enough water pressure in them to save the ballpark before the whole thing was destroyed. They were lucky the fire didn't spread further than that. And so Lowell Solman ended up rebuilding Hanlan's Point Stadium, now bigger and better than ever before. This is another one of my favorite old baseball photos of opening day at Hanlan's Point in 1908. Again, filled with interesting and some strange details. You can see this long, low grandstand wrapping around the field. Those triangles are the sails of boats out on the water. You can see, too, that the crowd is allowed to spill out onto the field back then, creating something of a human warning track. And in the distance, where the diamond is, you can see that there are fans out on the field wrapping all the way around the infield as well. I love seeing all the fans in all of their Edwardian finery. And as we come around to the left field corner, you can see the pennant that they had won flapping in the breeze, and that the amusement park is very much still next door. This roller coaster was called, I believe, the Royal George Scenic Railway, with the amusement park and the ball diamond right up against each other, as they would be for many years. You can also maybe get a sense from this photo that the new Hanlan's Point Stadium, just like the old one, was made of wood. And so this version of the ballpark did not last long at all. The very next season, the new ballpark burned down just like the old one had. This is a photo of that blaze in 1909. This time, Lowell Solman seems to have been a little better prepared. The ballpark burned down, but Lowell Solman, always an entrepreneurial thinker, found a way to make money off his own disaster. Ended up selling tickets to the ferries so that people could come over Toronto Bay and watch the stadium burn down close up. During the first fire, crowds had gathered on the mainland. Maybe Lowell Solman's brain had gotten thinking, so this time he made sure to take advantage of it. This time, though, the fire was also bigger than before. Not only was the ballpark burned down, but the hotel as well, and the amusement park next to it was also wiped out. So this time, Lowell Solman seems to have learned some lessons and decided that when he rebuilt his stadium, he needed to do it with some different materials, which is how we get the biggest version of the Hanlan's Point Stadium, which some called Maple Leaf Park. This time built of stone and iron, much less flammable. One of the biggest minor league ballparks of its day. I think maybe literally the biggest capacity, bigger even than some major league ballparks of its time. Lots more memories would be written at Maple Leaf Park, more Hall of Famers, more championships. It's where Babe Ruth hit his famous first home run. We're going to talk about some of those stories more next month. But Maple Leaf Park wouldn't be their home for too long, only about a decade or so, because right at the same time it was built, a new invention was starting to change Toronto. The first automobile was owned by a lawyer in the annex in the late 1800s. And within a few years of Maple Leaf Park being built, there would be more cars in Toronto than horses for the very first time. And Lowell Solman, always looking ahead, realized that the future of money-making in Toronto wasn't going to be out on the island anymore. It was going to be on the mainland where people could get to things by car. The old Hanlan's Point amusement park was shut down. Lowell Solman opened the new one on the shores of Humber Bay at Sunnyside, and the old ballpark would be replaced by one on the mainland as well. He got a big plot of land near the foot of Bathurst Street, which would become the new home for Maple Leaf Stadium. All over the offseason between 1925 and 1926, the construction raged forward at an incredible pace. This is what the stadium looked like in March of 1926. Opening day is just a few weeks away. With 3 days left before the stadium's first game, this is what it still looked like. Still very much a construction site, a scaffolding up, horses pulling supplies and equipment. And yet somehow, just in time, Maple Leaf Stadium was completed. They managed to do it all in one offseason. A whole new, beautiful ballpark rose at the foot of Bathurst. I think a lot about how it's taken us, 3 off seasons to complete all the renovations at the Skydome. Maple Leaf Stadium built from scratch in just a few months. It would become the new jewel for Toronto baseball for a long time to come, the new home for generations worth of memories. It was built by one of the city's most celebrated architectural firms of Chapman and Oxley. They built a lot of our waterfront icons like the Prince's Gates at the CNE, the Sunnyside Bathing Pavilion, and the Palais Royal. It had been built for an absolute fortune. Just, what is this, the 20s, 40 years earlier, Sunlight Park had been built for 1% of what Maple Leaf Stadium would take, all done in 5 months, and would end up serving as the Leafs' home for the next 42 years. Right up until the day they left and the minor league baseball era in Toronto was over. Officially, it was Maple Leaf Stadium. Lots called it the Fleet Street Flats because it was right there at Bathurst and Fleet Street. You'll still find some reminders that it was there. There's Stadium Place, I believe, little names of roads. And so this new era on the mainland began. Francesca from the Toronto Archive sent me this photo just a few months ago, which has become one of my new favorites because you can see the move that Lowell Solman has just pulled off. Here in the bottom right, that's Maple Leaf Park, the old Hanlan's Point Stadium. And then just across the western gap of the harbor, you'll see the new Maple Leaf Stadium standing in that place that Little Norway Park does today, with the Canada malting silos, a view you could have seen over the left field wall that are still standing there today next to Ireland Park. A place that had now tons of parking so that people could come using that new technology of the car. Toronto was about to start remaking itself in the image of the automobile, and it was now much more easily accessible to people who didn't drive as well. You could take the TTC right up to the front gate without having to worry about waiting in line for a ferry and then crossing the harbor and then braving the crowds on the way back as well. This new, more accessible ballpark would start a new golden age for the team, at least for a little while. The capacity was well over 20,000 people, so very much in line with some of our stadiums today, sort of in the same ballpark as BMO and the ACC, Scotiabank as well. And the crowds came out in force for those opening years. You can see too that there was capacity beyond the big grandstands, just like at Hanlon's Point, even into the middle of the 1900s. There was a human warning track available at Leafs games. My dad has stories of going to go visit the old ballpark and climbing over the fence to sneak his way in as a boy. The outfield wall was peppered with billboards filled with familiar brands to us, even in 2026. You can see the Horseshoe Tavern and Tip Top Tailors, whose headquarters were right next door, Goodyear and Loblaws as well. They won another championship that very first year in their new ballpark, just like they'd done at Hanlon's Point. We're going to talk about that team next month. It was one of the greatest minor league teams of all time. But this era would eventually come to an end. It was just a few years, really, after Maple Leaf Stadium opened that Lowell Solman passed away. And the franchise lost the driving force behind it. He had helped move them to the island in the first place, lost ownership for a little while, but then reacquired it and become this driving force behind a lot of the Leafs' success. Without him, the team started suffering a bit. And there were other factors at play as well. For a long time, all the way until I think the late 1930s, the Leafs hadn't been officially affiliated with any major league team, which meant that they were able to go sign free agents of their own will. Anyone willing to sign with the Leafs could come and play here for the full season without that threat of being called up to the majors. But now the Leafs did start becoming a minor league affiliate to major league teams. There were a whole slew of them. For a while, they were the minor league team of the Tigers, the Reds, the A's, the Pirates, the Phillies, the old Browns, Cleveland, the Milwaukee and Washington as well. Maybe most bone-chilling of all to any proper Blue Jays fan. For a while, the Toronto Ball Club was the minor league affiliate of the Boston Red Sox. And now it meant that all the most beloved Toronto players were a danger of being lost at any moment. Anyone who did really well in Toronto would inevitably get called up to the major leagues. So all of our stars were only here on a temporary basis. Toronto also started seeing itself more and more as a major league city. With the arrival of TV too, suddenly there was new competition. You can watch major league games at home rather than having to go down to Maple Leaf Stadium, which by the end of this era, starting to fall apart a little bit. Attendance in the 30s tanked. It's hard to even wrap your head around how few people were heading to the ballpark in these years. The attendance in 1932, so just 6 years into the life of this new ballpark, was less than 50,000. And that's not for a game, which there have been Blue Jay games that have a higher attendance number than that. That is for the entire season of 1932. The average attendance that year was 598 people. The grandstands at Maple Leaf Stadium were empty. There were all sorts of ways to try to bring people back to the ballpark. Lots of strange new additions to baseball heritage and tradition. One of the big ones in Toronto was the very first night game ever played in our city, ever played at Maple Leaf Stadium, which happened just 2 years after that low mark for attendance. Big modern light towers had been erected, meaning that we could now play after dark for the very first time. So exciting that when they had the very first game, they wanted to make use of it as much as possible. It was June 28th, 1934, when we got that first night game. And people wanted to make sure that we got the full excitement of playing after dark. The problem being that darkness in Toronto, just a week after the summer solstice, well, it didn't start until pretty late at night. So they made sure not to schedule the first pitch until 9:45 p.m. to make sure it was fully dark on the waterfront, so that the game didn't start until some people's bedtimes. To entertain the crowd while they waited, they ended up hiring a couple of comedians who then went overtime so that the first pitch wasn't thrown out until I think a little after 10 p.m. The game itself then got off to a pretty slow start. An hour had passed. It was now after 11, getting close to midnight, and they were still only in the third inning. By the time they got to the seventh, there was then another delay because some of the peanut vendors in the stands got into a fight. The whole game had to be paused for a while the peanut vendors were, I guess, peeled off each other. By the time the game finally came to its merciful conclusion, it was after 1 a.m., and the Leafs had managed to lose to Rochester by a score of 8-2. The first night game in Toronto was a little bit of a fiasco, though, as you can see, managed at least to fill the stands with something that for a while at least felt like a bit of a novelty. And so it's this era, the 1930s, the Great Depression, when people are struggling to buy tickets, but also looking for distractions. That's when we get donkey baseball. The very first game ever played on donkey back is said to have happened in Winnipeg, the invention of a Canadian entrepreneur. And it really took off across the continent in this Depression era and beyond. The rules changed from game to game. The whole thing was not particularly official, but generally the hitter would hit a pitch and then have to get on donkey back to round the bases. Sometimes the pitcher and the catcher were on donkey back as well. And some games the fielders were too, so that they'd have to convince their donkey to go chase the ball as it was hit out into the field while the hitter tried to get his donkey to round the bases before he could be thrown out. And in an era of strange attractions, this was particularly popular and deeply bizarre one as well. There were lots of donkey baseball games played all over Southern Ontario and in Toronto as well. It was my dad who first told me about it, memories of his father going to see donkey baseball in Toronto back, presumably in this era of the 30s and 40s. And so we have all sorts of stories about Torontonian donkey baseball games and how wrong they went. One big one was played a year before the game at Oakwood Stadium, which attracted again local politicians and other civic leaders. All sorts of bizarre stories from that game. One alderman was thrown off the back of his donkey. The circus clown you can see in the middle here picked his donkey up so he could run around the bases with it for a home run. At one point, children from the stands started spilling out onto the field, and police officers were trying to chase them down to keep them from being trampled, according to the press, by the bewildered animals. One liberal politician realized, I believe in the fifth inning, they'd been playing on the wrong team all along and switched sides halfway through the game. The biggest, most dramatic donkey baseball games, though, are the ones, it seems, that were played at Oakwood Stadium on St. Clair. It was a whole week of games that they organized by the York Lions Club to raise money for those kids' eyeglasses. And they were particularly notable because the donkeys they were using were particularly stubborn. The star was a donkey named Clark Gable. All the donkeys on this team seem to be named after famous movie stars. There was a Mae West as well. Clark Gable, though, he was the most stubborn donkey of them all. As one press report put it, according to the Star, Clark Gable seemed to have a spine made of rubber, throwing players off his back, supplemented by flying heels and what the Star called an uncanny knowledge of human wiles. In that game where the mayor had started pitching for one side, at one point, one of the players tried to get on Clark Gable and got kicked straight to the ground. In fact, almost no one could even manage to get on Clark Gable's back, never mind convincing this donkey to go down to first base. It ended up being that in one of these games, the organizers decided they needed to call in some experts. At one point, a couple of professional jockeys were invited to come down to Oakwood Stadium and see if they could get on Clark Gable themselves, given their experience with equestrian events. Both of those jockeys, however, failed to get Clark Gable down to first base. It said that in that entire game, only 2 hitters managed to get on the donkey's back at all. And no one, I believe, managed to score at all. It ended up being a scoreless tie. They were lucky, though, to get through a good number of innings, probably because everyone was being thrown out. That game with the mayor, they'd only managed to play 2 or 3 innings because donkey baseball took so incredibly long to play. Meanwhile, at the fringes of Toronto, another one of the most bizarre stories of Toronto's baseball history was playing out. In fact, I think donkey baseball isn't even the strangest baseball story we have to talk about from the 1930s. It's a story that starts in New York at Ebbets Field, where the Dodgers played, and where in his rookie year, Len Kennedy had been a star. He had, I think, 314 that year, was one of the leaders of the team, but then heading into his second season, suffered an injury that sapped his arm strength and maybe his hitting as well. He's said to have been one of the greatest fielders of all time. I believe that rookie year, he only managed to commit 2 errors the whole season, still held up as one of the greatest fielding seasons of all time. But thanks to those injuries, his sophomore season did not get off to a particularly good start. And eventually the guy running the team, Casey Stengel, told Kennedy and a few other players they were being sent down to the minors. They were on a road trip at the time, and so Kennedy and the others were left to make their own way back home, and now to their new home at the minor league affiliate's hometown. Len Kennedy, though, decided he wasn't going to go to the minors without a fight. Kennedy was quite an alcoholic, and he started getting drunk, it seems, before he even got on the plane home. And so while he was flying to the minor leagues, Kennedy started getting into trouble on his flight. So drunk that he ended up getting into an altercation with another passenger. During that, he knocked over one of the flight attendants. Things were so bad that the flight ended up making an unscheduled stop to kick Kennedy off the plane. It landed in Detroit, threw him out, and then continued with the rest of its flight plan, leaving Kennedy stranded in Detroit. And still, he was determined to find his way back into the majors. He decided he was going to try to charter his own flight to New York City so that he could try to convince Casey Stengel to let him back onto the Dodgers. The problem was that Kennedy didn't have enough money to afford a flight from Detroit to New York. But he did find sort of a freelance pilot and a friend of his who was a stunt pilot they called the Batman because he often did stunts jumping out of planes in a wingsuit at, I guess, fairs and festivals back then. They agreed to take Kennedy part of the way. He had enough money for them to fly him from Detroit to Buffalo, and then he'd try to make the rest of his way from there. But Kennedy was still drunk. And some point in the air between Detroit and Buffalo, Kennedy decided it was a good idea to try to convince the stunt guy, the co-pilot, Batman, to start doing some stunts in this plane. And when that guy refused to do it, Len Kennedy got violent. A fight broke out in the cockpit, with Kennedy trying at one point to take the controls himself. incredibly dangerous. This drunk baseball player trying to make the plane do stunts that he had no ability to pull off whatsoever, with the two pilots fighting back against him, trying to keep him from getting to the controls while also trying to keep the plane flying themselves. Kennedy just absolutely refusing to be quieted down, to the point where one of the pilots decided they needed to knock Len Kennedy out. And so as the plane flew in the skies above southern Ontario, ending up drawing close to the outskirts of Toronto as it wrapped its way around, I guess, south toward Buffalo, there was a fight happening in the cockpit. One of the pilots grabbed a fire extinguisher and tried to knock Len Kennedy out with it. Banged him across the head. Didn't knock Kennedy out, so he had to hit him again and again and again. It ended up being something like 10 or 12 times as the plane flew above the western edge of Toronto across the skies of Etobicoke. Eyewitnesses said they saw the plane bouncing around, diving and looping and shaking from side to side as the fight in the cockpit was carried out. Eventually, they approached the Long Branch racetrack out in southern Etobicoke near the lake. The plane ended up coming in really low. At this point, at about 1 a.m, at what then was an empty racetrack, to make this emergency landing. When the police arrived to find this scene, the plane landed here, as you can see in a photo from the press. The two pilots came out of the airplane splattered in blood, absolutely in shock at what they had just done. The police found inside the plane the dead body of Len Kennedy, who had been killed by the pilots trying to knock him out with that fire extinguisher. They were both put on trial for Kennedy's death, but eventually acquitted. The jury only needed minutes to decide that the whole thing had happened in self-defense. Surely the strangest single story from the whole history of baseball in Toronto. In the decades to come, though, there would still be some more bizarre stories to come, lots of them happening down at Maple Leaf Stadium, where in the 1950s, the crowds really started to return in force. This is despite the fact that this is the era when television's really catching on. Torontonians are now being able to tune into those major league games, and yet huge numbers of them are heading back down to the Fleet Street Flats in big crowds lining up for tickets, huge record-setting crowds for the minor leagues, all drawn by another entrepreneurial mind, a little like Lowell Solman back in the day. Jack Kent Cooke was always looking for a way to make a little money. He was himself a Torontonian. He'd gotten his start as an encyclopedia salesman and eventually ended up working for Roy Thompson of Roy Thompson Hall fame. Got into the media business from that, became very rich from it, rich enough that he was able to buy his local baseball team. So Jack Kent Cooke used those business lessons he had accumulated to try to find ways to draw people back to the ballpark. Cooke's ownership is, especially those early years, generally seen as another golden age for the Leafs. He did lots of big stuff for baseball in Toronto, was very active with the team. He had this phone you can see here installed right next to his seat so that he could call the dugout and make demands on the manager about personnel decisions. He also helped break the baseball color barrier in our city, one that had been created in large part thanks to the Toronto Baseball Club, as we talked about last month. It was in 1951, so just 4 years after Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier with the Dodgers, having played with the Montreal Royals the season before that, which would have included some visiting dates in the International League at Maple Leaf Stadium. Cooke hired 2 black players, the first black players in Maple Leafs and Toronto Baseball Club history, Charlie White, a very good catcher, and Leon Day, a Hall of Famer at pretty much every position. He played literally every position but catcher in his career, was one of the stars of the Negro Leagues. He never made it to the American League or the National League, So now that the Negro Leagues are recognized officially as a major league, he has earned that posthumous title. He was elected to the Hall of Fame just 6 days before he died. One of the greatest players of his age, often compared as a pitcher to Satchel Paige, and played so many other positions beyond that. 1951, playing his games at home at Maple Leaf Stadium. The thing Cook's probably most remembered for, though, is the ways, many of them strange, that he attracted those crowds to the ballpark and ended up setting minor league records. There were all sorts of promotions, even weirder than a lot of what the Jays are pulling out this season down at the Dome, with things like the Addison Barger Grand Slam pinch hit home run couch t-shirt they've got. At Maple Leaf Stadium in the Cook era, you had all sorts of raffles and giveaways, giving children bats, lucky to end without an outbreak of violence. There were fireworks displays. At one point, he hired a flagpole sitter to go up a flagpole and not come down until the Leafs had won the pennant. Big fan appreciation events, hot dog nights. If you think Looney Dogs at the Dome is good, Jack Kent Cooke had free hot dog nights at Maple Leaf Stadium. He brought in cheerleaders. There were family nights and ladies' nights, celebrity appearances. This is an actor, Jane Powell. They one night gave away a whole pony. Again, donkeys and horses not doing particularly well in Toronto's baseball history. The strangest, though, that pony giveaway isn't even the top 3 weirdest things that Jack Kent Cooke got them to do at Maple Leaf Stadium. One of my favorites is the day that players were drafted into a cow milking competition at home plate to see which player could milk a cow the fastest. I so desperately wish that they would bring this back with Vlad and Okamoto and Barger at home plate. And that maybe wasn't even the weirdest. One day they had a diaper changing competition at home plate with some of the players. Another day, in fact, I think maybe even more than once, Jack Kent Cooke announced that since the game was happening on a Friday the 13th, you could get into Maple Leaf Stadium for free if you showed up with a black hat, which seems like a bad idea in so many different ways. A stadium, a grandstand filled with cats, and also maybe is not great luck and karma for your team in a sport that's still deeply superstitious. I wish we had more reports of what was happening on Friday the 13th down at Maple Leaf Stadium. Lots of celebrity appearances, as I say, too. This, I believe, is Cooke sitting in his seat next to the famous boxer George Chuvalo. I don't even know what the guy in the background, this circus ringmaster, is doing there. The photo has no explanation for who that guy is or what he's doing back there. And just casually in the background is George Chuvalo and Jack Kent Cooke are hanging out in the front. Cooke's real dream, though, was to turn Toronto into a major league city. Every time a major league franchise was up for sale, was there trying to buy it and move it to Toronto. People have been talking about Toronto being a major league city since the 1800s. One of the co-founders of the National League, Al Spalding, had suggested it back in the Victorian age. At one point, Cooke even joined a scheme backed by Branch Rickey, the guy who got Jackie Robinson to play for the Dodgers. They tried to launch their own new major league, which would have seen a franchise in Toronto, but that fell apart, and so did every other effort Cooke made to get a major league team into our city. Eventually, he just gave up and pursued his major league dreams elsewhere. Cooke left his hometown for the sunny shores of Los Angeles, California, where he ended up becoming the owner of the LA Lakers and the LA Kings. He's the guy who built the LA Forum as a stadium and ended up owning the old racistly named football team in Washington. He even, for the rest of his life, ended up opening the Chrysler Building, one of the most iconic buildings in the New York skyline. Would own it to his dying days. despite the fact that he also had the biggest divorce settlement in history up to that point. He had married his sweetheart, still just a teenager, Barbara Jean Carnegie. They were together for 40 years before finally getting divorced, by which point Cook was so rich that she got this landmark settlement, actually awarded to her in a court case where the judge was Judge Wapner of the People's Court fame. It all led him to have to sell off a bunch of those franchises, which made him the antagonist in the opening episode of that TV show from a couple of years ago about the history of the Lakers back then. Meanwhile, back home in Toronto, the Leafs era was coming soon to an end. The crowds weren't coming to the ballpark as they once had, without Cook's entrepreneurial flair and with television helping to lead people to watch from their couches instead, and with people in Toronto really feeling like we were a major league city and that the minor leagues maybe weren't the draw they might otherwise have been. There were efforts to try to keep the Leafs going. There was a very creative and unlikely scheme to turn the team into a community-owned asset. Ordinary people could buy shares in the Maple Leafs. You'll still find certificates like this one bouncing around the city today from the people who invested in the team to try to keep it here back in the 1960s. That didn't last long, however. By the end of that decade, the Leafs were gone. I think it might be 1967 that they shut down and moved. The Maple Leafs headed across the border, went to Louisville, Kentucky for a while, where they changed their name to the Colonels, and continued on after that, moving from city to city. The ultimate fate of the old Toronto Maple Leafs, founded all the way back in the late 1800s to play at Hanlon's Point, is the worst, most heartbreaking end you could possibly imagine for a Toronto baseball team. Worse, one might suggest, than death is the fact that the Maple Leafs are now the AAA affiliate for the Red Sox, as they once were, having moved to Pawtucket to be the Pawtucket Red Sox, and then moved again to be the Worcester Red Sox today, the Woo Sox, feeding minor leaguers into the hated Boston franchise still more than exactly 100 years after they moved into Maple Leaf Stadium, and one with that wonderful 1926 team we're going to talk about next week. By then, Maple Leaf Stadium was looking worse for wear, and it wasn't long before the stadium was demolished. This was in 1968. Everything was torn down. They even sold home plate to this guy for $5, threw in that towel so he could carry it on his shoulder for free. And for a decade, Toronto wouldn't have a big professional team. It wasn't until 1977, nearly a decade after Maple Leaf Stadium was demolished, that our beloved Blue Jays finally arrived. We're going to talk about lots of stories around the founding of the Blue Jays, lots of those stories deeply strange, a couple of months from now. But next month, in the next lecture in the series, we're going to talk about icons of the diamond in particular. There are lots more stories to tell from this era of the Maple Leafs and other things that were happening in Toronto baseball during this time, including some of the biggest names ever to play baseball in our city. And so that's going to be our lecture next month as we talk about some of the biggest stars and most impactful players in the history of baseball in our city.